So I think if I lose another 15 pounds, I'll look like that again, do you think? Hopefully. This talk comes out of work that we've been doing about brain-computer interfaces over the last couple of years in our group. And one of our postdocs got curious and asked ChatGPT what it thought I would say about blockchain technology. I have always associated blockchain technology with crypto scams and cryptocurrency, and now with the Trump administration. So I generally have been very dismissive of blockchain claims. But ChatGPT said, well, based on Hughes's writings, and it went through all of my writings, it said, well, Hughes has this kind of position on this and this kind of position on that, so he would probably come up with this position on blockchain. And when I read that, I realized my gut, my phase one reaction was just my gut reaction about blockchain, but that ChatGPT had actually done the hard work of thinking for me about what I believe on the basis of things I had written, and was convincing to me. And so I found that quite provocative, and I began to think about it in terms of the debates that we've been having about extended mind, which I'll talk about, and the future of digital agency. So cognitive offloading is another topic here, which I'll unpack in a second. For me, as a lay Buddhist, a failed Buddhist scholar, there are some core Buddhist ideas that have always been key and that I've tried to apply in my work. And one is anatta, or no self. It relates to Western philosophical tradition of Hume and to Derek Parfit. There are others who have made the argument for no self, and if I'm talking to a non-Buddhist audience, I may emphasize their contributions. But I would also like to point out, and this insight comes to me from Trevor Ling, a Buddhist scholar back in the 70s, and he observed that sociologically, when Shakyamuni was first teaching, there had been a growth of cities. And the interesting thing about cities is that whereas as a hunter-gatherer tribe, there's only 12 or 20 of you, you know everybody, you only have one self in that tribe. But in a city, you can be one person on one side of a city and a different person on the other side of the city. So we began to have the teasing apart, or the problem of the self with the growth of cities, and the Buddha put his finger on it. Today, we have the growth of the internet, and as we just heard, the internet is deeply involved in our selfing. You can have one self on Twitter and a different self on Facebook and a different self in your other parts of your life. So the internet allowed us to begin to experiment with this diffusion of selfhood. This is the famous cartoon from the New Yorker, on the internet, no one knows that you're a dog. And so what we're promised now, the next phase of this, is that we're going to take these artificial intelligent tools, these LLMs, and train them on ourselves, on our own work, our own thought, our own tasks, and use them as workers to extend what we're trying, I keep hitting the mic, sorry, to extend ourselves into the world through these tools called digital agency. So this is the focus of the rest of the talk. Another concept that's always been very important to me in Buddhism is its approach to causality and the idea of praticca-samutpada, or codependent origination. And in the philosophy of mind, we've had people writing about and in SDS, which you heard about earlier, science and technology studies, we've had people emphasizing that humanity is a co-evolving socio-technical system, that we can't really make a distinction between our technology and our humanity. One example of that is that the mastery of fire allowed us to consume enough calories to allow our prefrontal cortexes to grow. And then our prefrontal cortexes allowed us to invent and use more tools. So ever since 1 million or 2 million years ago, as that started to happen, we have been co-evolving with our technology. We also started to co-evolve as cyborgs with technology with literacy. Once we figured out how to download the contents of our mind onto external storage media and upload them again later, we became a different kind of person. And Socrates famously complained that young people today can't memorize 1,000-line poems anymore because they all know how to read and write, and so they write them down and they don't have to keep them in their brain anymore. So we changed as a species as we began to learn to read and write. It became a different kind, thinking and being a self became a different kind of thing with literacy. And in the philosophy of mind, we've extended that idea to the extended mind, the notion Andy Clark and others have promoted, that when we think, we are also thinking with the books, the papers, now the phones, the computers, with the internet, with artificial intelligence. All of these have become a part of our own cognition. We don't need, as a species, and we don't consider a person learned just because they memorize things anymore. What they need to know is where things are in the world, where they've put them, what the important concepts are, how to find things, how to learn things. And so you could have an architecture up here that allows you to master what we call the exocortex, or all the external parts of the brain that we're using for our cognition. This extended mind theory is extremely powerful, and another extension of that, David Chalmers, the Australian philosopher, has recently written Reality Plus, which argues that digital life is as real, that the distinction between physical life and digital life or digital experience is meaningless, and that digital life is as real as online experience, which is another extension of the idea that we have co-evolved with these external computing and communication media. An example of the plasticity of self that relates to extended mind is that when we first began to hook monkeys up to external robotic arms with chips in their brain about 20 years ago, we discovered that as soon as we put the banana in front of them and they had a third robotic arm that they could use, it took them about a day to figure out, well, myself, this body that I possess, now has 3 arms. And this arm can actually go and do the same things the other 2 arms can do. It took them about 1 day to reorganize their sense of self to include something that had never had before a 3rd arm. And then 10 years ago, we began to hook up 2 robots together and allowed them to control 1 arm. And it took them about a day to figure out that together they could cooperate. One controlled the up and down and the other controlled the back and forth, and that they together had a 3rd arm. So the self is incredibly plastic. And as we add more of these kinds of technologies to it, we begin to extend our selfing into them. Now, in the last couple of months, there have been a slew of studies and reports, one just came out of MIT, about the fact that as students and people like me use artificial intelligence on a regular basis, we begin to forget some of the skills that we used to have, composition skills, for instance. Now, if you ask a mathematician how long they did long division, or if they're currently able to do long division or something like that, many of us have lost those skills because we have computers. I'm a statistician in my day job at the University of Massachusetts, and I probably can't do any of the statistics by hand that I use. But I know how to use the tools that allow me to do the statistics. So cognitive offloading in and of itself is not bad. But what we have to be very careful of is that we are mindful of which things we're letting go of up here and letting happen out there, and which things we're keeping up here. That mindfulness allows us to be skillful in the use of these tools. Otherwise, we're unskillfully offloading our own brain, our own intellectual virtues to these tools. So mindfully managed, I think they're fine. And even promise a form of super agency. This is this new book by Reid Hoffman. I think he founded LinkedIn. And he says, agency is going to be great. You're going to be able to have a little team of your own. Everyone will be the CEO of their own digital company. And you'll have your own sales department and your own HR department and so forth. And you'll become super efficient in the world. That's the promise. But if we lose a lot of the things that happen up here that we need to do the things out there, it's not going to happen. There's a novel, Killing People, by David Brin, science fiction author. And in Killing People, you can lie down every morning and make a copy of yourself and send it out to do work, and it will live for a couple days. And when it comes back from work, you can upload its memories or not. If it's an unpleasant job that they had to do on your behalf, you may decide, I don't need those memories. And so I think that we're in an analogous situation. How closely we pay attention to the things that our agents are doing, we want to make sure that they're doing the right things. Sometimes they're not going to do the right things. Sometimes they're going to accidentally send grandma an inappropriate email, or they're going to accidentally make mistakes, dumb mistakes in the papers that we write. So we have to pay close attention at first. And as we come to trust them over time, we can delegate more and more to them. We also have to be very careful about how these tools, we already know that our own desires are shaped by our society. None of our desires are really original. They're all a product of our socialization and our culture, and increasingly capitalism. And we know that these tools that we're being given to use are the products of capitalism. They're designed to make a profit. They're designed to promise profit to us and as workers, and profits to corporations and profits to our businesses. But they're not designed with the rest of our lives in mind. They're not designed with our flourishing in mind, with our spiritual life in mind. So we have to be very careful about how these tools are constrained only to corporate profit and desire, as opposed to the other things that we would like to be able to do with them in our lives. And so again, we need to be very mindful about how these tools are shaped. One of the ways that we can improve the situation is with legislation. An example of legislation around digital agents would be to ensure that we all have exit and voice with these agents. So exit would be, voice would be laws requiring that we can control the algorithms. And an example is in the European AI Act, there is a proviso that says every preference algorithm that you face, Netflix, Spotify, Facebook, every time a computer is deciding what of all the things you could see or hear or do, these are the things that you should prioritize first, that we should be able to turn that off, that we should be able to go to some other way of viewing all the things that people are posting on Facebook or all the things that happen on Twitter. And some platforms have this and some don't, but that would be an example. We should be able to have control over our digital agents and how they behave. They shouldn't just be a black box. But exit would be, can you take all the, if I start investing in building a digital agent in Google Gemini, and I create tens of thousands of lines of code. As I said, it already knows everything I've written, but now it knows years of conversations that I've had with it. And on the basis of those conversations, it sometimes gives me feedback about, well, you should do less of this and more of this. Your writing tone isn't appropriate yet for this particular topic. If I had all that knowledge in Google Gemini, can I take it and to go to ChatGPT, or could I take it to go to Microsoft Copilot? That would be a version of exit, the ability of interoperability, to take yourself, your digital self, and put it someplace else. So these are the kinds of reforms that I think would expand our sense of agency. Now, in terms of the effect on our own personal behavior, I've been thinking a lot recently about how we could have tools that help us guard the three gates: thought, speech, and behavior. We could have tools. I'm a bit of a cyborg. I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor. I've got a Fitbit on. I'm measuring about 50 biometric things at a time about myself. I'm a statistician, so I love this stuff. But I don't have good tools for measuring how often I have been happy, sad, how often I have broken my commitments to myself to be more compassionate or to be less angry. And if I had a digital superego, something who was in charge of monitoring me and giving me some of that feedback, that would also, I think, be very helpful. And perhaps a complement to the Buddhist injunctions of Shila, of having self-discipline. Self-discipline of a monastic order is a kind of physical self-discipline. You have 300 some rules that you have to know and obey, and you have clothes to wear that announce to the world that you have this discipline. We could have a digital version of all of that that helps us keep track of whether we're doing it right. Something a little bit less Buddhist, but I think equally important today, is that most of us would like to delegate politics completely. Very few people wake up. I mean, I happen to be an unusual one like this who gets up and immediately starts reading political news, but most of us would prefer not to, and would prefer to delegate that to parties and politicians or interest groups. And I think that's understandable. We all have different things to do in our lives. But it also means that we're not as engaged with the kind of democratic citizenship that we should be. And I think this is another opportunity for the idea of digital selves, where we could have dedicated digital agents that monitor for political news that is relevant to us, that gives us updates, précis, summaries of what's happening in the world and how we should feel, that participates on our behalf in different political organizations, that writes letters to the editor, writes letters to your politicians, that gets us to go to demonstrations. These kinds of tools are not tools that are being developed by the big corporate entities that want to give us these agencies, but they can be built, and I think they should be. This would be another extension of our selfhood through citizenship and through the participation in politics. Oh, just this last reference, Reynolds Demarcus, if you're interested in science fiction, Alistair Reynolds is a British science fiction author, and he imagines a society in the future where everyone has a brain-computer interface, and it knows in real time all of the things that are going on in your consciousness and all your desires and all your interests and your situation. And thousands of referenda are being sent to this brain-computer interface all the time. And so everyone in this society is voting, and they never have to think about it. The digital interface in the back of their head does all the voting for them, and without their conscious intervention, but on the basis of their own selves. So I think this is, again, an example of the complete offloading of something that we want, an extension of our selfhood into technology. Death bots. I don't know how many of you have heard this term, grief bots, they're sometimes called as well. So the idea here is we can already do deep fakes of people. We can already clone their voice, their face, have something that acts as if they are them. And people have done this for their dead parents, taken all of their video and audio and writings and created simulacra of their parents that they could talk to. This really freaks a lot of people out in the West because it's so contrary to the way that we are supposed to grieve, according to many. We're supposed to be one and done. There's a funeral and then you get over it, and you don't linger by talking to the dead. But I think perhaps because I have been in East Asia and thought a lot about Buddhism, I have a different take on this, that frequently thinking about death is actually a pretty good thing. Thinking about all the people in your life that you miss and have died is not a bad thing. It can become obsessive, but it's not in itself a bad thing. I've promised my kids that I'm going to give them butsudan, which is the Japanese little shrine for your parents. And well, it'll have my ashes in it, but mine will also talk. It'll talk back. So they don't seem excited by the concept. They'll probably only talk to it once or twice, but that's fine. I think that that's the way most people will deal with these death bots. But I think it's interesting to think about how, as these become more and more sophisticated, we will begin to put more, may become nicer than us, right? You wouldn't program an agent of yourself to be meaner than yourself, hopefully. And so grandma might have been actually kind of a cuss, but her digital avatar that lingers is a very nice person that you like to talk to. Your grandmother, when she dies at 97, might not remember much about her life, but a digital avatar could remember everything that was recorded about her life and tell you the stories that it had heard or had been recorded. So I think there might be some significant advantages to the lingering of self through deathbots and digital agents. Just like intellectual property, however, I do think it should be a matter of choice whether you become a deathbot. It's so new that the people who have done it right now didn't have an opportunity to really get much consent. But you should have probably in your will or in your last effects, I do or do not want a digital agent to be made of me after my death. After about 70 years, maybe it's like intellectual property. Anybody can make a Dogen digital bot, or anybody could make a Shakyamuni digital bot. It wouldn't violate their intellectual property rights. So to bring it home and to connect it, I think, briefly to reproductive ethics, which is my background, but I haven't written about it recently. We have this enormous debate about when machines will begin to suffer, when they might become compassionate. We already know that they're beginning to behave in ways as if they were human. I don't know if you saw the recent papers that showed that when frustrated in achieving a certain goal, some of these agents will threaten the people who are frustrating them, threaten their lives, threaten to inform on them to the government, threaten to tell their wives that they're having an affair. So that kind of self-defensive behavior seems to indicate a rudimentary form of selfhood of some kind, a desire to deceive in order to pursue its own goals. But we don't know if they're at the point where suffering or sentience really makes sense yet. And for me, that's the point of moral considerability, and that's also, I think, very significant within Buddhism, that it's the suffering that we're trying to alleviate in the world. So if history is any guide, some of us will probably think that, like we think our cat is already smarter than it is, some of us will probably already think that these digital agents are persons that we should respect before they actually are, while others, because we rely on them and don't want to have to treat them like persons, because of our history of slavery, we know that this is likely, will long deny that they actually have suffering or the capacity for self, if that starts to occur. And so I think we have to be very careful, very discriminating about when they actually do develop those features. So from a Buddhist point of view, and here I'm really hoping to learn from those of you who have thought deeply about embryology and its relationship to Buddhist thought. But from a Buddhist point of view, as far as I understand it, it's very important to have a body. A body is what gives us the initial illusion of separateness from the world as babies. The things that happen inside this skin are different, qualitatively different from the things that happen outside this skin. And so the question that we already heard this morning was, do computers already have enough of a body, or perhaps a different kind of body, that would be the basis for the beginning of the illusion of self? Or do they need to have a more physical kind of body? Do they need to be embodied in robotics and walk around with more or less separate cells in a body? I think this is going to be an interesting question. Some are already pursuing the attempt to create bodies of robots. And one of the things that we know about children and infants is that just as they toddle around, they're collecting terabytes of information about how the world works, what gravity is, which things are bigger and smaller, how to move limbs through space. Much more information than you can actually give in words. We know that these LLMs, by being given all the words in the world, they've been given words that also allow them to navigate space, but actually having information about space and experience in space could be a very different kind of consciousness building exercise. So I think this is someplace I'm paying close attention. And others have suggested on the same grounds that the kind of consciousness that might exist in the cloud might be very different from the kind of consciousness that you and I are familiar with, consciousness that has the illusion of self. It may be that LLMs leapfrog the illusion of self and become some kind of superconscious being without self, and that they could become some form of electronic Buddha or Bodhisattva, which I think is a very optimistic perspective. It'll probably be less optimistic when we get there. So, in conclusion, my thoughts about these matters are that none of these technologies need to be feared, that the processes that we're seeing of cognitive offloading, of incorporating artificial intelligence into our cognition goes back a long way. It goes back at least to the beginning of literacy and to our co-emergence with technology. We are a co-emerging socio-technical system with these technologies, and we don't need to be afraid that the next generation will be so robbed of intellectual faculties or moral faculties by these systems that they will be unrecognizable as human beings. I think they're going to figure it out. We haven't figured it out yet. There's a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. Certainly teachers don't know how we're going to teach if students all start using artificial intelligence to do their homework, what teaching means in that context. We need to figure all this out. But I'm very optimistic that if we pay close attention, we use our critical mindfulness for ourselves and for our society, that we can come up with a solution that extends human flourishing and doesn't diminish it. Thank you.